today's episode, we talk about the disaster of rent controls, the lack of housing supply in Scotland, and just how we can solve Scotland's housing crisis. With our special guest, John Blackwood, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Association of Landlords. Before we sort of get started talking about everything going on in the private rented sector in Scotland at the moment, I mean, can you just kind of tell us how the Scottish Association of Landlords came about and how did it all start?
Oh, now you're going back now. So I was one of the founding members and directors of SAL, and that goes back to 2000 and 2001 when we started. It was really at the time when we had the introduction of devolution in Scotland and the introduction of our Scottish Parliament, and when we were still making initial contacts with the new Scottish executive, as it was at that time. And I remember back then, we didn't have a national organisation in Scotland for landlords and letting agents. It was local groups, and I was part of an Edinburgh and Lothians landlord group. And we were meeting with representatives from government at the time, and they said, we need to speak to a national body of landlords rather than these disparate groups. Can you go away and create one? And that gave us the impetus, actually, to go away and create the Scottish Association of Landlords, which we did, and many of those members are still with us to this day. So as you can imagine, we've grown from an amalgamation of small groups of landlords into now the largest landlord and letting agent organisation, and the only representative group in Scotland as it is. And of course, our members come from all parts of the country.
I know that's really interesting to hear, and especially how it's grown and grown as well. Really interesting. So now I want to pick your brains a bit if I can. So if we can move on to rent controls, and I mean, they've sort of been a bit of a disaster, really. There's no other way to put it. And I mean, Scotland is seeing really high rents, and then now the Scottish government have decided they actually want to introduce more rent controls because they think it's a good idea. And I mean, firstly, what is your opinion on rent controls? And I mean, secondly, are you actually seeing more landlords leaving the sector in Scotland because of rent controls?
Yeah, well, first of all, we're certainly seeing more landlords leaving as a direct result, and I'll be able to give you some more information about that in a second. But I think we have to understand what the context here in Scotland is that there's very much a political agenda for rent control. And we've known that for some time now, because what we have, of course, in Scotland is the SNP in a cooperation agreement with the Scottish Greens. And that's all set out in what's called the Bute House Agreement. And it's very clear within that agreement between the two political parties, in order to share that power in Scotland and govern Scotland, it is set out in the Bute House Agreement that there will be rent control. And that's going to be a permanent fixture in Scotland. So we knew that the day and hour that they signed it. It's nothing that is a surprise to us on that. What was a surprise was the introduction of the cost of living emergency legislation, which introduced the first generation, shall we say, of rent controls in Scotland, which was a rent freeze, and then it was capped at 3%. And from the 1st of April, that's now been lifted a little bit more, and potentially some landlords could increase the rents up to 12%. But nevertheless, there's still rent control there. And the new housing bill that's now before the Scottish Parliament has permanent rent controls that will come in place in the next couple of years. So that's the political direction of travel. They're not going to change from that. That's been made perfectly clear. So, of course, we in the sector need to try and adjust our business models to cope with that. But many landlords are saying, I can't do that. I can't afford to continue to operate. And you were asking me what I thought of rent controls. It's a very blunt tool to deal with a raft of issues. And does it deal with any of them successfully? I doubt it does, because in the long run, when you have rent control, it means one thing, and that's rents go up. And another thing it means is there's a lack of supply, because landlords opt to leave the sector and there's less properties available to let. I don't think either of those two things are a good thing for landlords and letting agents, and certainly not for tenants either.
No, certainly not. Yeah, as you said, the supply and demand at the moment, and with tenants are struggling to find a place to live. And I mean, I want to ask you as well. I mean, what do you think of the housing minister, Patrick Carvey? I mean, as he said, landlords have nothing to fear over rent controls. He clearly thinks rent controls are a good idea. So, I
He
mean, what
does.
do you think of him on that?
Well, obviously we have political differences. I think it's important to stress that Patrick Harvey's always been clear on the political direction when it comes to rent control and reforming the private rented sector in Scotland. And he's achieving his aims. And indeed, all of what the Green Party is doing was set out in their manifesto before the last Scottish election. So, as I said earlier, there's no surprises about what they're trying to do and what they're achieving. What I think the point about is, of course, the damage it does to the private rented sector in the long run as landlords leave, and will lose good experience, and landlords who would still be providing much needed homes, of course, leaving and exiting, which means that the available pool of accommodation to renters, which Patrick Harvey wants to make better, is actually diminishing as we speak. And I don't think that's a good thing. They don't accept that. They don't believe landlords are leaving. All our evidence suggests that they are. But of course, Scottish Government wants to see those figures reflected in landlord registration figures. Remember, in Scotland, it's a legal requirement to be registered with your local authority if you rent property. So they do have national figures that they can reflect upon. And at the moment, they're saying, well, we're not really seeing much of a change in those figures. So we're not seeing those landlords exit. The issue is, of course, it's register you only update as a landlord every 3 years. And if you sell a property, you tend not to update the landlord register. So that's an issue. So it could be best part of 3 years before we actually see the effect of the current legislation and exactly how many landlords are leaving.
Yeah, and I was going to say, rent controls are a big part of landlords leaving the sector. But I mean, I want to go sort of, what are some of the other challenges that landlords face in the sector in Scotland, apart from rent controls? Which, what would you say? Like, what are some of the other biggest factors?
The biggest problem we have, and this goes for landlords throughout the whole of the UK, is we're not seen as people who are running businesses. So we're not able to offset costs against a rental income like plumbers or electricians, etc., would be able to do. So the issue for us is we're seeing through the cost of living increases, all costs going up. But we are this unique business where we're, certainly in Scotland, we've not been allowed to pass on our increased costs to our customers who happen to be renters. So we're not treated as businesses by HMRC or now by any government department, to be perfectly honest. And we should be. There should be a level playing field there because we're providing homes for people to live in. So the end product of our business is really important. And we need more and more people to be doing that, not less people to be doing that. So costs going up is a major issue. Of course, taxation is a problem, and that's reserved to Westminster. How landlords are taxed is another issue. But when you add all of these things up, for landlords looking at the viability of their businesses, they're saying, do you know what? There's no point in me doing this anymore. Many landlords are telling us that their businesses are no longer financially viable. From research we did with our members just before Christmas, 1 in 10 said that they had a let property that was no longer financially viable. And 40 odd percent said that they would be considering exiting within the next few years. So that would be their intention, and many more already have gone. So from our figures alone, if we extrapolate that across the entire private rented sector in Scotland, we estimate, and it is an estimate, that maybe in the region of 22,000 properties have already been lost to the private rented sector in the last year, just based on the research that we've got from our members. So the direction of travel, we know our members are selling up. They're telling us that. Our letting agent members who manage an incredible number of properties in Scotland are saying on average they're losing about 10% of their stock as well too. So everybody's saying the same thing. Landlords are leaving. The only people who don't seem to agree with that is the Scottish Government.
Yeah, I mean, as you say that a lot of landlords are leaving, and we need good landlords to stay in the sector. So, I mean, what would you like to see from the Scottish Government to actually help landlords stay in the sector?
Well, we need to see positive action. We need to see legislation that's going to support landlords and their businesses to encourage them not just to stay in the sector, but to continue to invest in the sector. We have a housing emergency in Scotland. Again, the Scottish Government doesn't agree with that, but every other organisation representing tenants, house builders, social landlords will all say the same thing. Yes, we are in a state of emergency. And we need more homes, not less homes for people to live in. So how can we create those homes? Well, that's where landlords come in to provide part of that solution. So the more landlords that sell up, the bigger problem that's going to be created further down the line. So we need to keep them. Landlords need to be respected. They need to be recognised by government as a vital part to the housing sector in Scotland. And actually, we need to encourage more investment in the sector. We had a recent meeting with our members and the Housing Minister, Paul McLennan, and he reiterated all of that. He said private landlords are vital to the housing function in Scotland and the housing system. But we don't see the legislation that backs that up. They seem to be very much empty words. And we're keen for government to put their weight behind those words and demonstrate to us that landlords are valued, that they're wanted in Scotland, and actually we need to see more investment in the sector.
No, definitely. And then, as you were saying, no, I mean, housing emergencies. I think there's been housing emergencies declared across, is it four councils in Scotland, I
Yes,
believe?
yeah, and there'll be many more out there that I've just not declared it. But every local authority will tell you that there's great pressure in the homelessness services, largely because landlords are selling up. They're giving notice to their tenants, and those tenants cannot find another home. There's just not enough social housing out there to accommodate all these people. And the solution is support landlords, encourage investment, but also have more investment in social housing as well too, and encourage
No,
more people who want to become homeowners. So it's about finding a solution that suits everyone.
no, exactly. I definitely agree. And one of the other things I wanted to ask you about was sort of what do you think about Airbnbs? Because you hear sort of in rural parts of Scotland, they're having a really, really big impact up there, and they sort of seem to be hurting rural areas in Scotland. So what do you think about the role of Airbnb?
Again, we tend to talk in a national context about lack of investment, lack of homes, but of course it is more perhaps pronounced in some areas, whether it's in the middle of our cities that have got other issues, or indeed, as you say, in our rural communities. So holiday lets has always been an issue which has been raised as damaging to the long-term housing sector, whether it's preventing people becoming homeowners within the local community or renters find a long-term home. And there is an argument for that. And of course, some of our members will operate within that sector, many won't. But it's vital to the local economy that we do have adequate accommodation for tourists, shall we say, as well too, within our rural areas as well as within our urban areas. But we need to have a balance, and I think this is all about balance. Legislation needs to strike a reasonable balance that encourages investment, that provides the homes we need for those who need it on a long-term basis, where they need affordable housing as well too, and also that we encourage investment in tourism and the local economy. So I don't think that's unachievable. I think we can do that. We just need sensible legislation. But I think what happens is we get these broad brush pieces of legislation introduced by government, which quite frankly, it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and they don't really solve the problem. And the problem we're talking about here is finding enough homes for people to live in. And all we're hearing is there's less and less homes, and it's becoming more and more expensive. Well, that's hardly a surprise if there's less and less of it.
No, exactly. Yeah, I think it is tricky sort of finding, as you say, that sensible legislation and also that balance as well. And I mean, my last question, I know it's a very like big question to ask, but what do you think of the future of the private rented sector in Scotland?
But that is a big question. So, how long have you got? So, yeah, it's crystal ball gazing time for me. It's something I'm asked quite a lot. And indeed, I ask myself, I'm a landlord, I also am a letting agent. So I'm directly affected by all the pieces of legislation the government introduces. What I say to our members and others is there will always be a private rented sector because it is a vital part of the housing economy and the housing system. The issue is how big is it going to be? What size is it going to be? And who's going to be operating within it? So, what will the landlord of tomorrow look like? And I think where we all are as landlords in particular is that we're adapting our business to these changing times. So rent control does mean rents go up. And for many landlords, the lesson is increase your rents on an annual basis. Many landlords don't do that, and they've fallen foul of that now because of that. So we might see a different approach to our business models where we are looking more to the future, looking at what kind of income we're going to realistically achieve from the rents, and of course manage that against our expenditure because we want to provide good homes. That's something every landlord should be wanting to do. And sustainable tenancies for the future, perhaps even with longer term tenants as well too. So there's a future there. I think the big question for many is this something you still want to be a part of? And for many of our landlords, we're an aging population. So many are taking the opportunity now just to say things are getting too tough. Margins are so tight. Maybe now's the opportunity and time to leave. The flip side of that, there's always new people coming into the sector. Arguably, there's not enough. That's what I'm saying today. But we will see a new generation of landlord who might well look to their business as a private landlord in a different way. And we will have to restructure our businesses. So perhaps be less focused on borrowing and basically, gear ourselves more to how we can create sustainable long-term businesses out of the private rented sector. So there's challenges ahead, but there's always going to be renters out there looking for us to provide accommodation.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, let's hope, a step in the positive direction and hopefully the next generation of landlords as well. So thank you so much again, John, for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to speak to you.